Hello and welcome to TNCRadio.live. This is Keep On Talkin' with your host, Tom Kirk. Tom is an over-the-road driver with over 2 million safe miles. On this show, he interviews the people who help make the trucking world happen. It's real life, live from the road.
On this episode of Keep On Talkin', Tom Kirk interviews a driver named Jackson Allen. This is episode 2 of the interview with Jackson Allen. Sit back and enjoy the episode.
One of the things that has amazed me in doing this show is how many of the drivers that I've talked to have started around the age of 13.
Right. I was going to say you're right, and that's kind of the last of that. There's that whole generational thing that we all talk about, and we hear in the trucking industry is it ain't like it was. And when people say it ain't like it was, they're referring to those days of learning to drive a semi when you were 13, 14 years old. Those are the days that they're talking about. And so it blows my mind when those days are gone. And I'm like, well, why are they gone? Like, who quit teaching their kids to drive trucks? My oldest boy is 11 now, and he's not driving on the highway yet, but he's driving around in the hayfield and ferrying hay bales around for me. And so it's this funny thing because everyone goes, man, I wish it was like the old days. And I'm like, well, somebody at some point just quit teaching their kids to drive at this age. And that was kind of the beginning of the end of the good old days, was when everyone kind of started pushing their kids away from, well, you don't want a truck. You don't want a truck. You need to go to school or whatnot. You don't want a truck. And unfortunately, all the good old boys, my parents included, kind of brought this on themselves, this whole death of the good old days.
I mean, I've seen some of that, and I think some of it, and I started in 2005, and my co-driver, I recently had, and I call it a privilege, of teaming up with a guy who's driven for about 45 years. So I'll tell you what, everything I thought I knew, I'm a rookie compared to him.
Yeah, I bet.
And I have learned more in the last couple of months than I ever did in the first 2 years of driving. I mean, some things I figured out on my own, but he showed me some better ways to do it, or he's been able to explain to me different things. But, he did encourage his grandkids to start driving, and the one started driving basically at 21. And I think there's a couple of reasons. One, I think it has to do with when the deregulation started happening, and then the formalization of the CDL saying you have to be at least 21, and then a lot of the insurance companies came in and started saying 23, because I know back when I was in college, late 90s-ish, I had looked into getting a CDL to drive bus. I got to know some of the bus drivers that worked at our college, and they drove tour bus in the summer and things like that. And the problem was a lot of these insurance companies, you had to be at least 23 before they'd even think about insuring you, even with these larger fleets. So I think part of the problem became, if you wanted to have insurance on your truck, you had to wait until, to formally hire the person, shall we say, in most cases till they were 23 or 21.
Right.
So I think insurance was part of the problem. But also a lot of these guys that I'm talking to, when they're talking about the good old days, they're actually going back to the late 70s, early 80s, in the days of paper log, pre-deregulation, a whole bunch of other things. And I think as I'm looking at it, there's like 2 or 3 different generations here, and each generation has a different version of what the good old days was. Like the guy I'm driving with, John, he would love to get back into a cab over truck like you're talking about from the 1980s or the early 2000s without all this electronic garbage. He has a few other words for it, but I can't use them on the radio.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure.
But and that's the thing that I'm kind of looking at. It seems like about every, because what year did you start formally driving, if you don't mind me asking?
Let's see. I got my CDL the day I turned 18 to drive in state, which would have been 2004. And then,
Okay,
of course,
so
as soon as I could update it, to out of state, I did. So,
in terms of total of years, you got about a year or so on me. But in terms of in-state driving, or intrastate driving, I got a couple of years on you. But we're roughly in that same overall bracket, shall we say? That's let's just round it up, round it down, and say it's 15 years. But to me, kind of what I've noticed, it seems like every 10 to 15 years, everybody changes the definition of the good old days.
What was good? I know, like in the 90s, they'd be going, "Oh, I wish it was like the old days," and then in the 2000s, I wish.
And it's like I'm one of those myself. I wish for the good old days before the Elogs and all this computerized garbage we got nowadays. But the funny thing is, if I go and talk to John or Idella, who both have been driving roughly the same length of time, they wouldn't give up their air ride. They wouldn't give up their power steering.
Right.
Depending on who I talk to, depends on whether they'd give up the single stick for the dual sticks, because a couple of the old timers want to go back to the dual sticks, so they have more gears. Some of them like that 10 or that 13 speed. There's a couple of the old timers. Oh man, I don't know, Jackson, if we can even call them old timers anymore. They like automatic transmissions.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. I've got a good friend that just switched to automatic, and I'm like, well, okay, yeah, well.
But I will say, for the Northeast, if you're doing a lot of traffic, it has its place.
Oh yeah. No, I'm sure.
But the thing is, when you talk to some of these people, they're like, "Oh, I wouldn't give up this and I wouldn't give up that," but they want the good old days. And that's the funny thing is, you talk to some of the old timers that says, "Oh yeah," I wish some of the good old days is back, but I don't want the air ride. I don't want the sprinkler in the truck. I don't want the non-power steering. I want my AC. I want the 600 horsepower fill in the blank engine.
Right.
So.
Yeah. So if I could walk you back, I think I could.
Certainly.
I think I could generally put a cap on this as far as what you could. In most general terms, if we just walk back in history here a little bit, as far as what kind of was the good old days and boys, so to speak, and what caused the death of that. And it's interesting. It's how let's see. They say that the death of the downtown. So follow me here for a minute. The death of the downtown was the shopping mall, right? That's what killed the downtown back in the 80s when they built all these shopping malls in these cities. So then the downtown became not really the place to be, and you could just go to the mall and get everything in one spot. And now the malls, a lot of areas across the country, are falling prey to the internet and online shopping, because why go to the mall when you can now just stay home, so on and so forth. So there's different examples, in the history of our country where things have morphed and evolved and caused times to change. And, of course, changed times is what makes everyone talk about the good old days. So in the trucking world, this is really interesting. So go back to those days, the 60s and 70s, and all across the Midwest and the West, there were just tens and hundreds and thousands of small farms. Small acreages. I mean, it was nothing for most farms to have, 1 to 400 acres, and for families to be making a living off of those size properties. And that's how it was. That was just the makeup of the country, clear across through the breadbasket and beyond. And as time went on, costs and things rose. So the original farmer, so to speak, started to realize that they needed to do a little more to make this farm work. So say he has 2 sons, and those sons go to college, they come back, they want to farm. Well, now we've got dad and 2 of the boys on the farm, and they're all realizing that this, 300-400 acres is just not going to support the boys and, mom and dad. So because of that, a huge amount of these farms and these ranches And these ag-based people, they'd go buy a truck, and they'd say, well, we have a truck attached to the farm or the ranch, and we run reefer, or we haul, pull hoppers, or haul cattle, and each family use semis, and that's where a lot of the, you fill in the blank for whatever name you want to use, but Allen and Sons, or Kirk and Sons, came from these small acreages branching out, and they use those semis to help subsidize the farm. So the boys can truck / farm. We can raise our families here on the farm, and we can do this deal. And that was kind of into the 80s. And then from my experience in the auction industry, that's another thing you probably don't know about, but I spent a lot of years as an auctioneer, full time, and I've kind of learned the history of the auction business. And in the 80s, the interest rates went crazy, and these small acreage farms and ranches started going bankrupt despite their best efforts with the trucking. And of course, that's why we had in the good old days of the auction world, they had farm auctions. Every weekend there's farm auctions all over the place because, so-and-so lost the farm, or so-and-so's retiring. They're getting out of it. They can't make it work anymore. So every weekend there was 2 or 3 farm auctions, in every small community from the, the mid 80s clear through the late 90s. And so a lot of the truckers that were back on the road clear back from when you're talking the earliest good old times, in the 70s, clear up through into the 90s, it was these really ag-based people. And I mean, in my mind, everyone always thinks the farmers and ranchers is kind of the salt of the earth, and we're kind of the simple folk, which is fine. And those were a lot of the trucks that were on the road. But as those small acreages had to sell out, they became bigger and bigger and bigger farms, and as they got bigger, they didn't need the trucks anymore, so they just focused on the farming. And it took a lot of this, ag-based people out of the everyday trucking world, where you don't see them anymore on the road hardly. And then you compounded that with our amount of consumption in the country now, where ordering online and everything's disposable and throwaway, and most things don't last for very long anymore. The demand for truckers is through the roof. So not only did you take away this old way of life by these farms becoming bigger and these ranches becoming bigger, those people left the trucking force, and as the years went on, we needed any and everybody to drive. And we make jokes about it now, about all the issues and problems we have with inexperienced truckers on the road, and it is a problem. But we kind of brought that on ourselves by the amount of demand that the country requires now. And so it's this twofold thing, and when you put them together, combined with nobody encouraging their kids to become a truck driver anymore, this whole culture or way of life that used to be back in the day just has slowly vanished.
Industry movement Trucking Moves America Forward is telling the story of the industry. Our safety champions, the women of trucking, independent contractors, the next generation of truckers, and more. Help us promote the best of our industry. Share your story and what you love about trucking. Share images of a moment you're proud of. And join us on social media. Learn more at truckingmovesamerica.com.
We kind of brought that on ourselves by the amount of demand that the country requires now. And so it's this twofold thing, and when you put them together, combined with nobody encouraging their kids to become a truck driver anymore, this whole culture or way of life that used to be back in the day just has slowly vanished.
I see what you're saying, and coming from the eastern half of the country, I have maybe a little different perspective than you do. And I will defer to you on the western half in terms of the farming. But from a lot of my experience growing up as a kid in the Northeast and talking to a lot of the drivers who got their starts up in the Northeast, and some of them, like you said, they start, and this is going back into the 40s, 50s, 60s, let's say New Jersey or wherever it was, they had the family farm and it just kind of failed. So at that point in time in the 50s, 60s, 70s, trucking, because it was considered to be a very respectable occupation, right up there with, let's say, airline pilots, train engineers. A lot of these companies, if you work for some of the union line haul companies, you were staying at the same places the airline pilots and crew was. You were staying at like the Statler Hilton in downtown Buffalo, or fill in the blank, fairly high-end hotel. So there was a certain expectation of how you were going to dress, act, and that you had a fair amount of money in your pocket. And from talking to some of these older drivers who were pre-deregulation and post-deregulation, deregulation made a huge difference, because some of these, particularly in the Northeast, a lot of these larger companies that had these specific lanes that they always ran for years with little competition, now all of a sudden had competition. And I hate using this term, but so many drivers have used it over the years. The freight rates started becoming a race to the bottom. And because of this, it sounds a little, I think it's a term that's a little overused, but sadly it's the right term. Where, because if you look at what a driver made in the 1980s, it wasn't until the last year or so with the pandemic that we're approximately making the same now, adjusted for inflation, as a driver did in the 80s. Because, about 7-8 years ago, I think the average salary for a driver was what, $42,000-ish a year, give or take a few thousand either direction. But let's split the difference and call it 45. But okay, great. That sounds like a lot of money, because they were making, 38-ish, give or take a little bit, 35-ish back in the early 80s, late 70s. But you adjust that for inflation, and it was between $80,000 and $100,000. So we were actually making roughly half 7 years ago of what the average driver made back right around, like I said, early 80s, late 70s. And a lot of owner-operators that I was talking to, what they were at least getting through the brokers, assuming they couldn't negotiate their own directly from the shipper, the freight rates were very equivalent to what they were being paid even 3-4 years ago to what they were being paid back in the early 80s. So when you looked at inflation, the cost of the trucks, cost of everything went up, but at the end of the day, it went down. And I would say it's only within the last 2 years, give or take a little bit, particularly the last year, you're seeing a lot of these large companies, saying, hey, you're going to make $70, $80, $100,000+ a year. So we're only just finally staying even with what a driver would make back from the 80s. And there was so many other industries, if I go back 10, 15 years ago, whether it was carpentry, electricians, whatever, if you're willing to put in a little work and effort right out of high school, particularly up in the Northeast, you could start work right away. And by the time you could have gotten your CDL and started driving for a lot of these companies at 21 to 23, you were probably making as much, if not far more money, than a truck driver with several years of experience would make. Some of it is the differences between regions. The Northeast has always been much more factory and blue collar when I say blue collar about the Northeast, I'm referring to like the factory jobs and the more company type hands-on jobs versus the blue collar farming jobs. Where you go out to the Midwest, you have your cities that are known for production like St. Louis or Kansas City or certain other, or Wichita with their, the aviation industry. But usually when you think of the Midwest, you think of corns, pigs, soybeans, cows, corn. Did I mention corn?
Yeah.
Can't
go wrong. Yeah.
You really think of a lot of stuff like that out there in the Midwest. So I think there was some culture differences, but I also think, like I said, for a long time up in the Northeast, really up until, yes, the steel industry was in trouble for a while in the Northeast, but it probably wasn't until the late 80s to mid 90s where it really started faltering. But, there was other industries up there. I know growing up in the southern tier of New York, the military defense industry and computers was huge. Growing up around Binghamton, IBM, that was the birth. The Binghamton region was the birthplace of companies like Singer Link, Link flight trainers from World War II, IBM, Endicott Johnson's shoes. And yeah, to a lot of people, they're going, who are these companies? Okay, with the exception of IBM. But, like Singer Link eventually became Lockheed Martin or Martin Marietta or Northrop Grumman or whatever they're called today. IBM, obviously everybody knows. Endicott Johnson's, though, really set a standard for the shoemaking industry. Arrow shirts, places like that was all found throughout the Northeast. This little company called Kodak. You might have heard of them. Xerox. These are all big New York State headquarter companies at one point in time. But, obviously some of them have moved and some of them have gone by the wayside. But, manufacturing was huge up in the Northeast. And a lot of the people, who couldn't cut it on the farms, whatever, like you said, got into trucking. But then trucking, at a certain point, people realized, hey, I can't make what my dad did in trucking, so I'm going to go work in X. Yeah. So I think the Northeast had a different set of issues than what you're describing, albeit related.
Yeah, and it all kind of came to a head at the same time, and then there to fill that gap, as you said, was these companies just got so huge. You look at any of these big mega carriers today, and they all started, it was like, Papa Jim and the two boys started, Schneider or J.B. Hunt or whatever. They all
Pop
started.
Warner, old man Hunt, old man Aaron's, among
old man
others.
Everybody, right? So they filled the gap, and it's just combine all these factors, all just kind of combining together, and just have created an interesting spot today where, like you said, it used to be kind of classy. My entire lifetime, that I've been aware of trucking, it's never been a classy thing. It's always been it's like the place where people go when there's no other, I've lost my job, I got laid off, and I head into the oil field and go pull tankers, haul water. I would really love to be able to help foster some change to where it becomes this neat community again like it used to be, whether it was the 70s, 80s, early 90s. We've lost that community feel. It's not we're all truckers out here. We're all just on our own, living in our own bubbles, and there's just not that connection like there used to be.
And I think from talking to some of the other drivers that I've talked to over the years, as well as for this show, I think there's a couple of factors for that. One is the advent of the Elog and some of the ways certain logging is done now, as well as some of these tracking things, and the extreme hyper litigation. And what I mean by that is, at one point in time, drivers would always pull over to check on somebody along the side of the road, make sure they were okay, to check on a fellow driver. You'd hear the stories about 5 or 6 drivers pulling over, discovering somebody had a bad water pump, and lo and behold, somebody usually had a working water pump the same type somewhere in their truck. My co-drivers told me the story one day of when he was going across California, pulled into a rest area and saw this guy, basically with his engine pulled apart, going, that truck looks familiar. Realized it was a friend of his, and he is doing an engine rebuild in a rest area. And he said,
Dude, that
this
is
guy
legendary.
carried pretty much everything he needed. I guess the only thing he didn't carry was like the top and bottom of the engine because he didn't have enough room in his sleeper. But he carried pistons, he carried rings, he carried just about everything he needed for a full rebuild in his truck at any one time. You know,
Yeah.
but these were the drivers that were always prepared either for their own problems or to help out others. But with the Elogs, with the tracking, the liability, drivers like, no, you can't stop now, because if you do and you get hit, we'll get sued. And you're going to get fired because you never should have stopped in the first place. You know, and one of the things that I had by driving with the guy I am now, he's showing me some of the older school ways and explained to me, okay, this is the reason why we did things this way. This is why they were telling you things at the bigger companies. And then he's giving me time to figure out what makes the most sense for me. And usually it's kind of a hybrid between the two. But what I'm kind of discovering is a lot of these company policies, which we were told like they were the gospel truth, the letter of the law, were litigation prevention strategies. So a lot of this stuff that we were being told was to minimize not the driver's liability, but the company's liability. So one of the first things they said is, you know, they kind of brainwash you, not listening to the old timers, because what they're going to tell you is going to get you into trouble. So they kind of discouraged you from listening to some of that knowledge. Or they would program you that, okay, they're going to say this, but if you do X, Y, and Z, you're going to increase your risk for litigation. To protect your license, you need to do the following. And I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying it's unsafe. But it is the company trying to protect themselves as much, if not more, than you. So some of these company policies, even when I drove for one of the mega fleets for 12 plus years, sometimes it make me scratch my head. And now that I'm more on the outside and have gotten to know some of the people at different trucking companies, some of the, doing radio, I've talked to some of the people right at the FMCSA, insurance industries, et cetera, and I'm starting to understand some of their policies were for litigation prevention. The other thing is, with the change of the hours of service, where everybody kind of started stopping and ending at the certain times, a lot of these smaller truck stops that really promoted the driver's table went away because whether it was they weren't getting the drivers to stop the way they used to, whether it was the owners were getting up there and the kids, either because of inheritance taxes or lack of interest, didn't want to take over. So we had all of these various issues coming into play. So when you look at it from that perspective, you had this community that disappeared of where drivers would talk, and then, as much as I hate to say it, the CB, partly because of social media and other things, but a lot of it because of people going, I got no panties on. And people just getting tired of listening to the I'm special kind of comments and things of that nature. People just got tired of it and says, hey, I have other options. I got satellite radio now. I can listen to this on my phone. So a lot of that camaraderie and the joking that everybody used to have and getting to know each other on the CV disappeared.
Yeah.
And I think it was, I don't think we can pick any one set of things. I think it's a large bunch of things. But the biggest thing that I kind of realized, having partnered up with this older driver 3 years ago, I don't know if I would have been receptive to some of the stuff I'm being taught now, because I needed the time away from the corporate brainwashing.
Oh, interesting.
And now that I'm around from it, I'm a lot more open, because a lot of people were joking at my company, because both of us can be a little opinionated. They were taking bets as to how long before a body bag was going to be needed for our truck.
Oh man,
We're actually getting along great. We actually get along really well, and everybody's looking at me going, "You mean you two haven't fought yet?" And I goes, "Why?" I said, "He's a grumpy old jerk of a curmudgeon, but so am I. We get along great."
Oh goodness.
TNCRadio.live is proud to carry the Steve Summers Overnight Drive Show. TNCRadio.live is dedicated to commercial drivers. We offer the news, traffic, and weather you need, and the entertainment, sports, talk, music, and celebrity interviews you want to hear 24/7. We have original shows and trucker podcasts that feature some of your favorites, like Ice Road Alex Debogorski and America's Truckin' Sweetheart Marcia Campbell. TNCRadio.live is convenient and designed for professional drivers. The best part is we're free, and you can listen anywhere you are on the road. With just one tap, you can tune into Steve Summers and us right on your phone. Simply download our app by going to app.tncradio.live. That's app.tncradio.live.
The video of a kid that had created some collapsible pull-up bars on the side of his trailer, and he was, it was posted just to show, like, hey, this is cool. It was just this kid. He built these things to try to stay in shape on the road, so he could do some pull-ups and dips, and just a little bit of physical fitness. Well, all the comments, not all, 70% of the comments were either your form is wrong, you're doing your pull-ups wrong, blah blah, or the DOT is going to shut you down because your trailer's, a half-inch over width now, and that's not approved. Or it was just all this negativity. And so I couldn't help it anymore, and I commented, and I said, what has happened to the world that no one can say anything nice? And even if this kid had bad form, or even if you thought the DOT was going to hassle him now, just shrug and go, that's pretty ingenious anyway, and move along. You don't have to nitpick. Yeah. And you won't believe this, Tom, but a guy who's a trucker actually commented on my post and said, if you're thin-skinned, you need to stay off social media. And I was like, dude, how sad is your situation in your life right now that you are going to defend negativity and all this awful and all this demeaning stuff that goes on social media? And it just blew my mind, and it just made me realize how sad it can be for a lot of people out there, and how negative their just overall mindset has become.
I'm going to share something that I share with very few people, and I know I've never shared on the radio before. So consider, everybody lucky. Going back a number of years ago, and I was probably in the industry about 2-3 years at the time. My son got hit by a pickup truck in front of our house. He was about 4.5, 5, broke his femur. And at the time, I was training for my company, and that was the trainee I had was my last trainee ever. I just did not have the right mind frame to train again because I could tell my temperament had changed. And actually, one of our safety directors says, if I put a trainee on the truck with you, because I'm talking to her about the situation because some people were trying to get me to take another trainee. If I put a trainee in the truck, am I going to have to put a body bag on the truck with you? And I looked at her and said, yes. Come and see me when I don't have to put a body bag on the truck. Because I knew my temperament at that point. I was not in the right mind frame to train another person, so I realized that, and I stepped away, which was a good thing. But because of all the stress of medical bills, this, that, and the other thing, not being home, being criticized by a whole bunch of people for trying to earn a living for my family, whether it was the school, whether it was this group, whether it was that group, for not being home and attending these meetings and being there for my son with a broken femur, it started getting to me. And I don't know if you remember or you ever listened to Sirius back in the day before it became Sirius XM. Ethan Lockridge had a day where he would call Safety Valve Fridays, where drivers could call in and vent. And I was having a rough time that day, and this was not long after Carl Mayfield went off the air, and I can't remember who took over after him after Evan. And anyways, I was just kind of calling in saying I was having a rough time of it and this and that, and trying to get some information on where I could find some help that Evan had and to talk to somebody about just some of the stress I was under. And what amazed me is after I got off the air, the next 3 or 4 callers says, well, if you can't handle this is part of trucking, you need to get out of trucking. This goes back for almost as long as I can remember. You know, this goes back to the days of CB radio, the days of the truck stops, where it's the, we are manly men and we don't have emotions. Bullshit. You know, and some of it is in this industry, some of it is the drivers. You know, we're manly men, you know, or women, as the case may be, or well, manly women, womanly women, whatever term you want to use. I know
yeah, tough women, strong women, manly men, and
strong women, manly men, strong women. Please don't cancel me. But in all seriousness, for a minute here, you know, we have this this perception that everybody has to be strong all the time, and even a lot of companies, a lot of DOT doctors, if you mentioned the word depression, okay, what do you want to call it blue? What do you want to call it upset? What do you want to call it depression? They hear the word depression, they think it automatically suicidal. And they want to pull your DOT card, they want to do all this other stuff, and we're almost conditioned to not admit we're having a rough time. And I think that is a bad thing because, you know what? We're human. You know, I'm sure you've had your challenges out there, you know, whether you've talked about them publicly or not, and I'm not expecting you to, but I'm sure you've had your challenges, just like I've had my challenges. And the thing is I think almost every driver I've talked to has had their challenges. So why do we think, or so many people feel, that we have to be tough instead of just admitting, hey, trucking's not easy. The average person is never going to understand what it's like to miss kids' birthdays, to miss certain holidays, to miss soccer games, whatever it is, because we have to earn a paycheck. And I actually had people in my neighborhood telling me how I could file for disability so I could get off the road to spend more time at home with my family.
Oh boy.
And you know, I actually had one of the counselors my son was seeing back, you know, after he got hurt, looked at me and says, you're one of the few fathers I know. I says, I hear people criticizing you. I says, it makes me so mad because you're actually out there working. You have insurance. You're doing the best you can. And she pretty much looked at me when my son wasn't around and says, everybody else. You know, and that's the thing is one of the lessons I took is as a trucker, we're not, well, as you know this, we're not normal to begin with. We, you know, to be trucking and to do some of the stuff we do in an industry where we're in one of the, usually in the top 10 for the most dangerous jobs in America, it takes a special kind of special to turn that key on everything and get out on the road.
Right.
And I don't mean that in a bad way. It just takes, you know, just like a lumberjack and certain other jobs, it takes a certain kind of person who can do that. But it also takes a certain type of person that understands, hey, life's not all roses, but I need to earn a living for my family. And I think you're a little unique in that you have so many different skills that you can fall back on, which I think is a good lesson to a lot of drivers. Don't just rely on trucking. Try to find something else you can do that you enjoy that allows you to have a little supplemental income. Do you think that's an accurate statement?
Yeah, no, I'm all for having a lot of weapons in my whatever, a lot of tools in my drawer, tools in my belt, weapons in my drawer. There we go. I'm all for trying to be as multifaceted and handy, you know, as much of a Leatherman as you can become, so to speak, you know, a multi-tool. Yeah, definitely do it because you're, you know, and there are times where you need to step away from. That's one of the unique things about trucking is if you do have some other skills or hobbies or things that can generate some income, you can step away from trucking, for whether it be for weeks or months at a time, and then come back to it when you need it or whatnot. So I'm all for that, and it keeps your life perspective a little better. And it's not healthy for any trucker to be locked up in his truck alone for weeks and months and years on end. So I'm all for that. That makes everybody a little crazy.
Now you know why I'm crazier than Heavy D and Diesel Dave combined. I spent too many damn years alone.
Oh, I know.
But I think something you've kind of mentioned that I kind of wanna talk about a little bit is you've been an owner operator most of your life. So if you wanted to step away, it was a little bit easier for you because you either had other people who could maybe haul your trailer, or you had other side businesses. For a company driver, it may not always be as easy, particularly if you're dependent on the company for insurance or a regular paycheck or wherever. So for somebody who's a company driver, do you have any advice for them as to some things they can do to maybe either relieve that stress or get that little bit of break if they feel that they might need one?
Yeah, you bet. As far as, if you're in a situation where you can't step away from the truck, you need to really make an effort to get out and get away from your truck. You can see it when you drive down the road. I'll just give this as an example. You drive down the road at the truck stop, and there's TVs on, video games going on, and all that does is further isolates you. And I know you're not always in a position or a place where you're spending the night where you can get out and have some social interaction. And I'm not saying go to the bar, but just to get out and get away from your truck. And then I'm talking this is on the day-to-day versus, being able to step away from driving. But it's important to take some time. You got a 34-hour restart. Whether you take an Uber across town and go visit a park or a place or whatever, you need to get out. Don't spend your 34-hour reset laying in your bunk, and it just adds to your problems. You need to go to a place where you're around people and rather than further isolating yourself when you do have the moments to do things or see things or visit a landmark, or as silly as that sounds, to stop and visit a landmark. Or it sounds silly, but it's important to get out and get away because technology is geared towards isolating all of us further and further and further. So that's the problem. If you just rely on technology, it's not going to do anything but isolate you more than you already are.
And I can't agree more with that. One of the biggest things that I've become a fan of over the last 2 years is Uber and Lyft. And I'll give a good example. In the Little Rock, Arkansas, I've had to, or even in the Memphis area, I've had to take some time off there. Because the co-drivers that I've usually had have lived somewhere in Arkansas, and my home is up in the Northeast. So if we're taking our time off in Arkansas, I've got some friends here, so sometimes I might go visit them in Northeast Arkansas or out towards the Memphis area or wherever. But I usually have times where, hey, they're busy or whatever, so I need to figure out something to do. And do you know? It only costs like $15 or $20 to go from West Memphis over to Beale Street. And do you know how much fun you can have on Beale Street? Even if you don't drink, There's food, there's barbecue, there's music, there's all kinds of fun you can have on Beale Street. Little Rock, down by the waterfront, it's, I think, a $10 to $15 ride from the Petro truck stop. There's all kinds of music venues, different kinds of entertainment, that's going on there. And if, you can get out of the truck. And one of the things I've started doing is if I have a weekend off, and I don't do this all the time, but at least once a month, I start looking around to see where can I find me some music.
Yeah, boy. I like hearing that.
Excuse me. And the thing is, I grew up in high school and in the church playing music and being involved in music. And I kind of got out for a while. But back during the pandemic, when we got so isolated and things started opening up, I ended up at a couple of truck stops that had a bar nearby where somebody was playing music, or I shouldn't say a bar, restaurant and grill. bar and grill,
Yeah,
whatever you
place
want to
to go
call it.
listen, live music. Yep.
And somebody was, I had dinner with my co-driver, and there was some music in there, and I'm just sitting there, and I'm smiling, and I'm kind of grooving and everything else. And my co-driver had a real rough night at the time. I won't go into details, but his girlfriend had just wrecked his Challenger.
Oh,
Totaled it.
shoot.
He was not having a good night. But by the time we left, we had a nice meal. We had listened to some really great blues. And he was in a lot better mood. And it really, that night showed me how important it was to get out of the truck, to get away from some of your stress, and be human. And that's one of the things that I've kind of realized. And it was a lesson I had to learn the hard way. And it's a lesson that I think, I'm not saying you've learned it the hard way, but it's a lesson that you're kind of sharing tonight. Trucking is a job. You can be human, but to be human, you have to sometimes get away from your truck. The truck, that Peterbilt cab over you talk about, it's a big part of your life, but you don't let it control you. And I think that's the biggest takeaway I've kind of gotten from talking to you in the last little bit is, it allows you to make money. It's allowed you certain opportunities with Heavy D and other things, but you don't let it control you. You let it be a tool to give you opportunities, but you have a lot of fun in the meantime.
Yeah, and it's a challenge, and I'm not perfect at that by any means. There are times, of course, where I feel controlled and feel, with customers and, certain relationships to keep up. There's times when, being the boss, you gotta go because there's nobody else to cover the load. But I am so.
And I mean, a great example of that is we wanted to have this conversation a good month and a half ago, and
exactly.
you had to be an adult and actually work to cover some loads. So I mean,
you're
I
right.
understand.
You're right.
And that's the thing that sucks when you run a business, is that if for some reason the S hits the fan, you're the one that has to pick up the slack. So it sucks, but it's part of being an adult. It's part of being a trucker, and it's part of this.
Hey, thanks for listening to TNCRadio.live's presentation of Keep On Talkin' with your host, Tom Kirk. For more information, or to ask a question, or to tell more about your story, send email to info@tncradio.live.